How much do you really know about your family history? Could you tell me about the details and the intricacies? Could you tell me about their stories and how these shaped you? A year ago, I honestly couldn't have answered these questions. I couldn't have told you what I actually knew about my ancestors. But then there was a moment that changed all that for me. It starts as many of my favorite moments do. I was sitting at home on the sofa in my PJs with a cup of tea. I was flicking through the TV channels and I landed on a documentary about the independence of India and the partition that followed. The documentary followed the stories of 4 British Asians as they traced back their family members who had crossed the India-Pakistan border during the time of partition. For the first time that day, I saw families on the screen that looked like mine, and people, like me, searching for answers. As I watched this documentary, 2 thoughts crossed my mind. The first was how familiar some of this footage felt. I saw these images of families packed tightly together in carts, on boats, on trains, whatever they could, desperate to flee. And then I saw this one single image, an image of a boat, the kind that would have been used to carry people to safety from one shore to another. And this one single image made me realize why it all felt so familiar. Even though partition had happened several decades ago, as I was watching this documentary in the summer of 2017, the Syrian refugee crisis was fully unfolding across our screens. By this point, 12 million Syrians had left their homes. 6 million were actively seeking refuge, and thousands were camped out in the jungles of Calais just across these shores. The second thought that came to my mind was an incredibly overwhelming one. I'd been watching the news every single day, but I had never, not once, connected the dots. We never used the word refugee in my family. Definitely not to describe my grandparents. But my grandparents had been alive during partition, and they too had crossed the India-Pakistan border, leaving behind their homes and everything that they knew. Maybe, just maybe, the trains and the boats they crossed in wouldn't have been so different to the ones that I was seeing on the news. And then I was filled with this moment of sadness, because I had never asked my grandparents about these experiences whilst they were alive. I had never found out their stories and what it had been like for them. So for the last year and a half, I've been tracing back my grandparents' story as they crossed the border during the time of partition and resettled. I've spoken to dozens of people who lived through the experience of partition. I have dug through newspapers and archives. I've read the literature and the poetry of the time. I'm by no means a partition expert, but the lessons that I have learned from looking backwards have taught me incredibly important lessons about moving forwards. So today I would like you to come back with me. I would like you to travel through space and through time, all the way to India, all the way back 72 years ago, to the land that my grandparents grew up in. I would like you to imagine a balmy summer's evening. It is the midnight of the 14th of August, 1947. It is in some ways a magical evening, and the air is electric with anticipation because an entire nation is waiting for history to be made. As the sun sets on India that evening, it does so on one country, and as it rises the next morning, it does so on 2. The Indian Independence Act of 1947 that gave India back its freedom after nearly 200 years of the British Empire invading and ruling over its land also came with it a price. In its final binding piece of legislation, the British Empire negotiated that there should be a land for Hindus and a land for Muslims. And so India became India and Pakistan. These new borders resulted in the largest forced migration in the history of our world, leaving behind a trail of death, destruction, and displacement. 14 million people were displaced, thousands of families torn apart, thousands of women and girls on both sides of the border kidnapped and raped. A staggering 2 million people died. Can you imagine losing your home, your identity, your nationality? Now, can you imagine this happening on a mass scale to millions of families? Partition was, without a shadow of a doubt, one of the most heartbreaking events to happen in the world. It redefined the fates of entire nations and families. My family was one of these. During the time of partition, my grandparents, who had not met yet, were in East Pakistan, or as we came to know it after 1971, Bangladesh. They were both Hindus, which meant that they had no choice but to cross the border. My grandfather crossed first, before partition was formally announced. It was a decision that many families made as rumours of the divide were circulating and violence was gradually escalating. My grandmother followed several years after partition had been formalised, and after she met my grandfather, they were married, and they resettled in Kolkata, in West Bengal, in a house on 66B Park Street. 66B Park Street is an address that holds a deeply profound meaning for my family. It was the first home that my grandfather and our entire extended family had when they resettled in Kolkata. It was a home that saw generations of my family grow up. These memories from childhood to old age, packed in between the walls of 3 rooms and a veranda that used to get splattered when the monsoon rains came. What I've only recently come to appreciate, though, is what it means to have a home like this when you've lost one. It was such a labour of love for my grandfather to have this home. As the eldest son in the family, he assumed a large share of the responsibility for enabling his family to resettle. That included helping them cross the border, earn a living, and of course have a roof above their heads. I've always thought of my grandfather as an incredibly patient and gentle man, but my research helped me discover a new side to him. I learnt that at the time he came to Kolkata, the city and the surrounding districts were still recovering from the Bengal famine. The Bengal famine was a man-made famine that killed 3 million people in a mere 2 years from 1942 to 1944. 3 million in 2 years. No place was left untouched by the famine. It was made so much worse by wartime colonial policies and massively accelerated inequalities. The result was that millions of families were left in debt and there was a deeply struggling economy. At the time that my grandfather came to Kolkata, it was not a prosperous city. It was definitely not one built for thriving. It was a difficult place to be. I learned that he worked incredibly hard to set up his construction business, which manufactured bricks and built homes and offices. One of the stories that I heard over and over again about my grandfather was about how relentless he was in his attitude to work. He would go out for hours on end, each and every single day, in the heat and the dust of the city, doing whatever it could to drum up business, knocking on doors, investing his time, his money, and his energy. Over time, he was able to grow this business, so it not only provided a stable income for himself, but went on to employ 30 to 40 people each day, men and women alike, who, like him, worked long, hard hours. I like to think that in some way, my grandfather's business and the hard work that so many people put into it, in some way helped rebuild Kolkata, brick by brick, into the city that it is now. So what I learned from my grandfather is that there is no shortcut for hard work, and there is no substitute for grit. I learned that he put in the hard work and the grit so he could lay the foundations to survive, so that those that came after him could thrive. And so my family were able to move into 66B Park Street. I spent many a school summer holiday visiting my grandparents. And when I think about these summers, I think about the heat, the humidity, the constant noise of car horns, the incredible food, and the smell of the barn that my grandma was no doubt chewing on. Barn, known here as betel leaf, is a leaf that is combined with tobacco and is the small guilty vice of many in India. The chewing of pan is like a ritual, its preparation as important as its consumption. My grandma took this ritual very seriously, and she was always surrounded by an assortment of these small tins in which she used to store all the various bits needed for her pan. To my surprise, one of the stories that I learnt about her doing my research were about these very same tins. I learnt that she crossed the border after partition had been formalised. She was a young single woman, and it was an incredibly dangerous time for her. I learnt that she took whatever valuable she managed to get hold of and put them in these very same tins, which she then hid in her blouse and hid in her sari. In leaving behind everything that she knew, she remained a resourceful and determined woman. This determination she carried with her her whole life. In the upheaval of her childhood, my grandma did not get the chance to finish school. So after she was married and she became a mother, she made sure that each one of her children had that chance to complete their education, the chance that she hadn't had herself. This was true not only for her son, but also for her daughters. My grandma fought against social pressures and family expectations to make sure that each one of her children were educated. She taught us that education is absolutely everything. What I learned from tracing back both of my grandparents' stories is how much hard work and determination they put in so that they could survive, so that those who followed them could one day thrive. So now I would like you to come back. I'd like you to come back from India, back from 1947, all the way back to this moment. I've spoken a lot about my grandparents today. Researching my family history has fundamentally made me change the way that I view not only myself, but the world that we live in. I believe that each and every single displaced person should have the right to the opportunity to rebuild their lives, just like my grandparents did. This opportunity to resettle and rebuild is one that research shows can have a massive impact. So if you're one for numbers, here are some for you. In the UK, analysis from the Centre for Entrepreneurs shows that if we provided business support to all 20,000 Syrian newcomers expected here by 2020, we would be saving the taxpayer £170 million. If you think about how much this costs us, that's a 35 times return on investment. So it's one thing to know the numbers, but what do you do with them? We live in a world where it's so possible for each one of us, with our daily actions and our daily habits, to enable people to rebuild their lives. We live in a world where we can volunteer with refugee entrepreneurs. We can support refugee-led businesses by buying their products and services. We can donate to camps across the globe. And we can use the technology on the end of our fingertips to help somebody working on their language skills. It is so possible for each and every single one of us to play a part, no matter how big or how small we want that part to be. Retracing my grandparents' history has also fundamentally changed my understanding of myself. I know now that they worked so hard and put in so much determination to survive so that we who followed them could one day thrive. They are perhaps the reason then why my mother was able to become the student that she was, why she went to medical school, where she qualified as a doctor and met my father, who she eventually went on to marry, and of course have my brother and me. I'm amazed to think that some of the opportunities I have had in my life, like going to university or standing on this stage today, are because of her and what she imparted in all of us. That education is the tool that helps you build not just a living, but a life. I'm amazed to think that my entrepreneurial spirit and my audacity to set up a business came from my grandfather, my own personal Richard Branson, who showed me that with hard work and grit, you can build anything that you dream of. We so often look for inspiration externally, but imagine what would happen if instead of looking at our TV screens and our phone screens, we instead looked at our own families, and we looked internally, we looked backwards. Imagine how much inspiration we could find if we looked at our own family stories. It would be enough inspiration to fill every square inch of this room. Though the generation that survived partition suffered extreme amounts of pain and loss, doing this research has showed me that human beings have the ability to survive in the face of absolute adversity. My grandparents taught me that we are all whole, complete humans, lovers and fighters, entrepreneurs and writers, with loved ones and lost ones. It is in the face of total and complete loss that resilience and character develop, and these are the qualities that eventually enable us to thrive. In the face of adversity in my day-to-day life, I now tell myself, your family did not cross borders for you to give up here, because I know now that I stand on the shoulders of giants. I always have. Looking backwards and reconnecting to my family history has enabled me to not just have a deeper understanding of myself, but also the world that we live in. So if you too are searching for that sense of purpose or belonging, identity or understanding, I cannot urge you enough to look backwards, because it might just help you move forwards. Thank you.